And without editorializing, I'd like to say that Brazil is passing through a very difficult moment in the country in terms of the options in the elections and what might happen after the elections. And so the questions and the debates that we have organized, not necessarily anticipating what would happen this year, I think are very much germane to the current discussions that are taking place in Brazil. And in that regard, today's talk about race in Brazil and rethinking the national narrative of race is very much being played out in a different way in the current electoral debates in Brazil. And so it is with immense pleasure that I get to invite Yuko Miki to come to Brown and be here at Brown with us today. She is Associate Professor of Iberian Atlantic History and the Associate Director of Latin American and Latino Studies at Fordham University. A native of Tokyo, Miki concentrated in history at Brown University, so she's one of ours, where she was introduced to Latin American history and culture, and she shared with me that she took a class with Thomas Skidmore, one of his last classes at Brown. She is the author of Frontiers of Citizenship. I have to show the book to everyone. They can see that. It's hot off the press. It just came out. A Black and Indigenous History of Post-Colonial Brazil, published this year by Cambridge University Press. And her work has received the Lassa Brazil Section Best Article Prize and the Nupir Chaunhuri Prize for the Best First Article from the Coordinating Council for Women in History. A recent scholar in residence at the Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture of the New York Public Library. She has a forthcoming essay in social text based on her new project entitled In the Trail of the Ship, narrating the archives of illegal slavery. And today her talk is, Where Are the Three Races? Rethinking the Racial Narratives of Brazilian History. Welcome.
Thank you to all of you for being here. It's so great to see so many faces. And thank you so much to Jim Green for the invitation, to Ramon for organizing everything seamlessly, and the Center for Slavery and Justice for co-sponsoring. And Neil, great to see you. So nice to meet you, Marcelo, now. And thank you again for all of you for being here. It's really delightful. It's so meaningful to me to be able to come back to my alma mater after, I will say, an X number of years, not to date myself too much. But yes, it's been a number of years, but it's so amazing to be able to come back to speak about my own book as a historian. And yes, in fact, I did concentrate in history, but in Renaissance Italian history. I was, those I would call my Eurocentric days. So obviously, things have happened since then, but I did have the fortune of studying with Thomas Skidmore in one of his last seminars. And so, Jim just mentioned it, but since it's a question that I get all the time, so I just thought I would just address it before, since you had that thought in your mind. Am I Brazilian? I am not Brazilian. I am from Tokyo. I was actually an international student who came to Providence one day rolling a suitcase and had no idea that parents help their children move onto campus, so I just came by myself. So I have no personal connection to Brazil, but why do I study Brazil then? Because I get that question all the time. And my quick answer would be that it's called attending Brown. I became really interested in performing arts in Latin America. I did a GISP. Do those still exist, GISPs? Okay. On the history of Latin American performing arts. And so that was kind of my point of introduction, but it was not a direct line. I actually took a lot of time between undergraduate and grad school. But all this to say, just beware of where your studies will lead you, because it might come back many years later, and before you know it, you have a PhD in Latin American history. And I also remember, are there still things called bate-papos? Do you guys still do them? Okay, awesome. I used to go to that because people were nice and there was a lot of free food. So that was always works, right? So that was one of my first exposures to Portuguese. And I will also just confess outright that I actually never studied Portuguese. I am self-taught, but I have to thank a lot of the people here and people I came across since then. And I was able to kind of learn it in the field, so to speak. And then also afterwards, moving to New York City, meeting many people who became my mentors. It was kind of a long process. It wasn't like a straight line. I didn't come here. Maybe had you been here as an undergrad, it would have been very different. So I took my time. But here we are today. So it is a difficult time in Brazil. And I was, and I think, but we're also very fortunate that we have someone like Jim. And I actually feel inspired that even in our brief conversation right before we came here, that we can do things. We can organize and do things about it. So thank you, Jim, for that. And I look forward to hearing more from you and all of us, right, as we go forward. So now turning to my book. So what I like about history and about research is that sometimes things fall apart. And then you then find something a lot more interesting. And this is exactly what happened to me. This book originated in the collapse of an original research project. I was going to work on quilombos. I wanted to work on slave resistance, and I was going to work on Bahia and quilombos late 19th century and their connections to today, right? It's a kind of very popular topic. But I went for the first time into the archives, and I just didn't find anything. So I was like, okay, that didn't work. And I was looking around Salvador. But it was through coincidence, and also the kindness of others. And I will say that that is the key to any research, but also to life. I was told about a European immigrant colony in the extreme south of the province, sorry, I say province, I live in the 19th century, in the state of Bahia. There was a European immigrant colony that eventually turned into a black community. And today, or at that moment when I was doing my research, it was demanding quilombo status as a recognition from the Brazilian government as what was called remanescentes de quilombos. So I was like, oh, extreme south of Bahia, this is basically literally the tip of Bahia, sorry, I don't have a map, almost at the border of Espírito Santo and Minas. It never even occurred to me to look in that region. I think a lot of people don't. But I started poking around in the sources from that region in the 19th century. Almost no one does. And I was just astonished by what I found in the archives. Plethoras, slave insurrections, quilombos, fugitive slave communities, European slave masters, just source after source. And I was astonished. But I was also troubled by what I was finding because I kept on finding sources on people who were not supposed to be in the archive. And those were Indians. And these were right on the Atlantic in the middle of the 19th century. Why are they there? Hadn't indigenous people disappeared, especially from the Atlantic, long ago? Why were they in the archives, and why do we know so little about them? So I was confused as somebody who was beginning the research, and it ended up making me think about all these historical narratives that we're familiar with, but that also end up shaping our own work. In particular, I'm talking about that very well-established historical narrative that we all know, or most of us know, that first there were Indians, they were enslaved, they were decimated by disease and violence, and then they were replaced by Africans, right? That's why Brazil is black, right? And the largest black nation in Latin America. We take this story for granted, right? That's the way we teach our classes, we teach slavery, we teach Brazilian history, and also Caribbean history that way. But where does this story come from? As I contemplated this plethora of archival sources on the indigenous, I started thinking increasingly about our own complicity in reproducing certain stories. I started wondering, why do we organize Latin America according to these racial narratives? For instance, of Brazil and the Caribbean as being defined by slavery and the African diaspora, and Central America and the Andes as these indigenous parts of Latin America. Why do we Brazilians rarely consider the indigenous people as historical subjects, especially after the early colonial period? And why is it that when we talk about race and racial democracy in Brazil, we're actually only really talking about black and white, or the spectrum in between? So we talk about three races, I guess we sing about I guess we didn't have a chance to play Clara Nunes' famous O Canto das Três Raças, right? But it's all about black and indigenous in Portuguese Brazil. We talk about it, but we don't actually think about it. Where are they? But even as I was starting to think about these questions, I was tempted all the time to look at these sources and say, you know what? Why don't I just turn the page? If I don't look at the indigenous sources, I can write a much more straightforward history about slave resistance, about quilombos. But what if I didn't? So the result of that decision is this book. And just as an FYI, paperback coming in May from Cambridge University Press. It's supposed to be a Lhasa. Well, let's hope for the best. So I ended up writing this history of post-colonial Brazil that brings together the history of the African diaspora and the indigenous Americas. And I speak actually as someone who was literally in the history of the African diaspora program at NYU. So that was my track. I was already kind of pre-trained to study blackness in relation to other enslaved societies of the Atlantic world. We're not actually really trained to look beyond those connections, right, in a way. So through this book, I want us to think about how can we think about these fundamental issues that not just Brazil, but many post-colonial Latin American nations confronted? Issues like slavery and abolition, unequal access to citizenship, the constructions of racialized difference and national identity. I'm trying to say that we can't really think about these issues without accounting for the histories of both Black and Indigenous people. By bringing together these two histories, I think that we can start to see how this political elite of post-colonial Brazil, they embrace a very inclusive national identity in the mid-19th century. They actually embrace race mixture as a national racial identity. So a mixture of white, Black, and Indian. But I started to think that we could actually see how the exclusion and inequality of Black and Indigenous people, living Black and Indigenous people, became integral to this vision of a mixed national identity. And I also want to look at how Black and Indigenous people also contested and proposed alternative visions to these nation-building projects. And perhaps, of course, I wasn't thinking about it when I wrote this book, but maybe in this moment, with what's happening in Brazil, maybe there will be some relevance today as well. So I address these issues through six thematic and loosely chronological chapters. I begin with the issue of slavery and citizenship, popular politics, race and national identity, law and violence, geography, and finally labor and abolition. The book is also located in a place, as I was saying, that most people don't look at. You know, most of us like our urban areas. It's for various reasons. But I ended up researching this place that I ended up calling the Atlantic frontier. It's basically an internal frontier in Brazil along the Atlantic Ocean, if such a thing were possible. It's so as I said earlier, it's the region where the provinces of Bahia, Espírito Santo, and Minas Gerais meet. And I so kind of travel between that area and the capital in Rio de Janeiro. This is a unique area in the sense that it had been sparsely inhabited, although in the Atlantic, this was specifically a result of Portuguese crown policy. Why? Because Minas Gerais, of course, as many of you know, and as the name implies, it was a big mining region. And the crown wanted to prevent the smuggling of precious metals and and stones from the interior mines to the coast. And so this area was that strip of coast. So they basically did not allow people to inhabit that area because he wanted to control smuggling. But there's another reason why it was not inhabited for most of the colonial period, and that's because of the indigenous population. They're known as the botocudo. It's actually a Portuguese word based on the botoques, or these lip discs that they had in their lower lip. But they were kind of known to be very tenacious resistors to settlement. And often colonists feared them for their cannibalism. There's actually no real evidence that they were cannibals, but you see these discourses of cannibalism come up, especially in certain periods of war. So the indigenous population too had also fended off settlement. But this begins to change as there's a decline in mining outputs. And the crown and eventually the Brazilian state, and of course local settlers themselves, start increasingly to want to move into this region. Part of the thought thinking is that, oh, there's still more untapped mines in there that we haven't found yet. But a lot of people are actually now thinking, oh, maybe we can actually develop the region, you know, for agriculture, but also we want to build all these roads connecting the interior to the coast. So it becomes kind of targeted for a lot of development and settlement after independence in particular. But what happens is that in the settlement of this region, the way it takes place is that it's not just the settlers come in. A lot of the people who allow the actual settlement, the clearing of the forest, for this was a place of Atlantic forest, the tilling of fields, those end up being African slaves. And not only is it that, it's African slavery, it's extending into indigenous territory. And in this process of settlement, I argue in my book that we also see how this process of settlement of the internal frontier creates unequal regimes of citizenship. So for the rest of the talk, I'm not actually going to talk about each chapter, which will be too long and cumbersome, but I'm just going to highlight some of the arguments in some of the chapters, maybe with some examples, and if anyone has questions, I can elaborate later. So in the beginning, I talk about the Constitution and about the construction of citizenship and slavery. Of course, right, slavery and citizenship, one of the central issues in post-colonial Latin America, right? Many of them are republics, for Brazil is not yet, but you have citizens, but you still have slaves. And in this chapter, I'm arguing that from the very moment of its birth, the Brazilian nation excludes Black and Indigenous people from the citizenship in two connected realms. On one hand, the Constitution, and the other hand, slavery. So it's also a way to kind of link political processes in the center, so to speak, and also what is happening on the frontier. And in particular, I look at the convergence of African and Indigenous slavery on the frontier. So as some of you may know, the Brazilian Constitution, which is issued in 1824, is remarkably inclusive. It actually grants citizenship to any free or freed person on Brazilian soil, who's born in Brazil, regardless of race. So this contrasts, for example, with the race-based exclusion of the United States. So it's this ideal, it's this principle of jus soli, right? If you're born on that land, you have citizenship. But excluded, actually, from this citizenship are slaves and the indigenous. And the reasoning is very interesting. You know, the statesmen who are discussing the Constitution say that, for instance, slaves and Indians are, they say, merely Brazilian, but they're not citizens because why? Because they live outside of society. Now, this idea of outside of society kind of implies that Brazilian society was those of basically people of Portuguese ancestry, Portuguese culture, speaking Portuguese, Catholic, etc., and others lived outside of it. For slaves, of course, it was also a juridical status. They were excluded from citizenship as slaves, but they could become them as long as they were born in Brazil. You could be manumitted, and then you had a right to citizenship. Africans, not so much. Indians, however, are a more interesting case because although they are native to the soil, they are not granted citizenship because they're not civilized. And the thing is that the Constitution never actually elaborates on how indigenous people could qualify as citizens. There's actually debates about it. How can we do catechism? What can we do to, civilize, etc.? But they dropped the issue, which I think is significant in itself. And this vagueness about Indian citizenship, I think, has very severe consequences. Because as I'll talk a little bit later, they basically lose protection, legal protections in many ways. So those are kind of the debates that are happening in Rio. But what's happening on the frontier? So the Crown, on the eve of independence, gives a land grant. There is a group of Swiss and German immigrants, and they receive this land grant in basically what is the Atlantic frontier, in the south of Bahia, in present day near the towns of Caravelas, Viçosa. I think they're more like beach areas now, but it was that area. I don't go to the beaches there, but I'm sure some of you may have. Now I see it in like luxury beach ads all the time, Transcoso, that area. So the immigrants call this, it basically called a colony called Colonial Opaleiro. The intent of the Portuguese crown that gave this land grant was interesting. They wanted these white immigrants to civilize the hinterland. They wanted them to basically fight off indigenous populations. But they already were envisioning kind of a racial project. They wanted to bring free white labor into these indigenous territories. And at the same time, they were hoping that they would kind of create an intermediate class of producers for the domestic market that would curtail the power of large landowners. So the immigrants get this land. They're supposed to be free laborers. They're supposed to bring in more immigrants. But quite the opposite happens. In a few decades, it actually ends up becoming a thriving slave plantation with over 2,000 slaves. And it becomes the biggest producer of coffee in this region in southern Bahia. So in terms of an early racial nation-building project, because this continues into the post-colonial period, it is a spectacular failure. And you actually see, even in the sources, the accolades, the excitement people had for this colony just diminishing increasingly, and people are saying it's not a success because they have slaves. But in this meantime, this region is also a war zone. There has been a just war, it's actually a legal thing, a just war against hostile Indians, the Botocudo whom I mentioned earlier. The Portuguese crown declares this war in 1808, saying that all humane means are impossible and have to be suspended. So they wage a war against these indigenous people that actually outlasts Brazilian independence in 1822 and continues until 1831. This war, called the Botocudo Wars, unleashes horrific anti-indigenous violence. Settlers seize indigenous lands, and moreover, they enslave many indigenous people. And importantly, this slavery is legal. So first of all, of course, when we talk about slavery in Brazil, especially by the 19th century, almost nobody is talking about indigenous people. But here we are actually seeing a just war against indigenous people born in Brazil, and it's sanctioned. It's a legal act. But perversely, Indian slavery, it's interesting to compare it to African slavery or black slavery. It's supposed to be pedagogical in purpose, right? The Crown and later the Brazilian state, that they say, oh no, enslaving Indians is going to civilize them. It's going to help prepare them for citizenship. And eventually they'll be released from it. But of course, in practice, who's gonna do that? Settlers in this region, there's a very sparse population, they need laborers, they have their Indian slave, they're not gonna let them go. So they just kind of end up in this status, legally, and even after 1831, they remain in slavery and without much legal protection. And very little is done to curtail it. And in particular, the people who are targeted are children. They're known as curucas, indigenous children, and they were coveted, they were bought and sold, they were trafficked, sometimes very long distances. It became almost like a vanity item, or for some people in power, dispensing indigenous children to their dependents became a way of kind of consolidating patronage ties. And this trafficking of indigenous children also continues long after it's outlawed in 1831, so much that, like the illegal slave trade, transatlantic slave trade to Brazil, it's basically an open secret. One provincial president who's speaking about Indian slavery calls it a perfeito cativeiro, right? Perfect captivity. So what we're seeing now is how this post-colonial settlement of the Atlantic frontier is being realized by the extension of African slavery, not white free labor. And this African slavery is fusing with and accelerating indigenous slavery. And this lasts well into the mid-19th century, if not later. So we can see how this process of frontier settlement and incorporation, we can look at it as a way of incorporating land and territory, but it's also a process that creates people who, as slaves and as quasi-citizens, are actually excluded from national participation. So nation building is actually relying on the construction of people who are excluded from that very nation. So I'm going to skip just talking about a chapter on popular politics, in which I think I talk about indigenous people, Africans, African-descended people, how they kind of contest these processes of colonization settlement. I talk about quilombos, mocambos. I'll talk a little bit more quilombos later because I actually do write a lot about them. But also just briefly saying that it's very important not to presume that citizenship is kind of the goal for everybody. We are very kind of used to thinking about slavery in the Atlantic world, slaves claiming citizenship, especially Laurent Dubois' work about the French Caribbean, Revolutionary French Caribbean. So we kind of see that as a goal, but if you think about indigenous citizenship means often territorial loss, forced assimilation, forced migration. So it's a very different way of thinking about what citizenship actually means when you put them in comparison. So next I want to talk about maybe one of the core chapters of this book and also of my larger argument I'm making. Mestizo Nation, Indians, Race, and National Identity. So this is a chapter in which I really break down this idea of race mixture as an inclusive racial ideology. What I want to do is to really go beyond the intellectual history of race mixture and racial democracy. I think there's a lot about that. And also we talk about it in relation to the Black movement in Brazil, but I don't think we really think about the origins and like what it means to think about it maybe from a social history perspective. What does it mean to have race mixture implemented on the ground? And what I found is that it's actually a very exclusionary practice. So the Brazilian elite, like many other Latin American elites at the time of the 19th century, they have this concern, right? Frenchmen, Luis Coutinho, they're coming and they're like, Brazil, they said, you don't have a people, right? And they're being criticized for their race mixture. So there's this great kind of concern about saying, defining who are we as a people, right? The povo brasileiro, that expression is kind of haunts people, right? And it's a lot of these Brazilian elites are concerned that we don't have a povo brasileiro because we're so heterogeneous, we're so mixed. We have so many indigenous and African descended people that we don't have a people. And so what they really want is homogeneity, and that's a really kind of big aspiration, right? And that homogeneity in both racial and cultural terms. So what the solution, so to speak, that they adopt to this problem of heterogeneity is miscegenation. So it becomes a national racial project. And of course, this puts Brazil in great contrast with places like the Andes or Argentina that really just abhorred the idea of miscegenation, right? They don't want to mix with indigenous people, especially the memories of the Andean rebellions, etc. But in Brazil, it's not just an aspiration. It actually becomes a central feature of indigenous policy. And this you can see in this big national legislation, actually the only national legislation called Regulamento das Missões, or Regulation of Missions, from 1845. And this is the same year that a German naturalist wrote the famous essay called How to Write the History of Brazil, in which he praises Brazil's origins as the mixture of the three races. So it's kind of the originary moment. So what becomes clear as you look at the relationship between this idea and its practice is that while miscegenation seems racially inclusive, right, let's all mix together, let's bring everybody in, its real goal is actually the opposite. It's the erasure of indigenous people. In other words, we're looking at the emergence of indigenous extinction as an idea in Brazil. And this idea actually gets produced simultaneously in many, many different areas, and I'll get to that shortly. So the purpose of this 1845 regulation of missions, this law, is to acculturate Indians for incorporation into national society. The statesman José Bonifácio called this the one body of the nation, right? Once again, the idea of a single Brazilian people. But this indigenous legislation is also kind of going in tandem with another thing, land reform. And that takes the form of a major land law in 1850, and these two laws prove to be excellent partners. For example, the regulation of missions encourages Indians to live on state-funded aldeias or Indian villages. And not only that, so Indians are made to live on these aldeias, and they also encourage settlers to move around it or even onto these lands in order to increase contact. But what happens is that when you encourage indigenous people to move onto these aldea lands, what happens? The original territories, the vast territories that they had lived in originally, are reclassified as empty, or the legal term being devolutas. And so these lands then get reverted to the state, and then they are able to sell them at the local level. And if missionaries encourage Indian civilization through intermarriage between Indians and these settlers that they are invited on, their mixed-race offspring are also no longer Indian. An Indian who speaks Portuguese is no longer Indian. An Indian who adopts Catholicism is no longer Indian. So through these arguments of both culture and biology, indigenous people begin to disappear like magic. And again, if these lands no longer have any Indians, just mixed-race people, they're not Indians, then these lands get reverted back to the state. So by the second half of the 19th century, one increasingly finds examples of these Indian villages that become extinct. And many territories, people claim, there are no more Indians. So imagine what it means for us historians to go into the archives and read, these aldeias are extinct, there are no more Indians. If we just take that for granted, then that becomes the truth. And similar claims of Indian extinction is also being developed in very disparate areas, but kind of working together. Maybe these are more familiar to some of you. Literature, visual art, and increasingly a new scientific field called anthropology. So Romantic Indianism, as it was called, may be well known to you. We have equivalents here, right? Last of the Mohicans and all that, kind of praising the romanticized Indians as kind of the progenitors of the nation. So Brazil had their version, celebrating the idealized colonial Indian. So of the distant past, right? These usually women or kind of effeminate, if I may say so, men who helped these Portuguese settle Brazil, perhaps maybe gave birth to a mestizo child, and then they conveniently died. Such representations help fix indigenous peoples in a distant colonial past and not in the present. But anthropology, this new science, also does its own share of the work. Of course, many of them are European, the US, but a lot of the Brazilians are also emerging to kind of join in this field. And they are obsessed with indigenous crania. And in particular, they are obsessed with the Botocudo, the indigenous people I mentioned earlier. They become collector's items. They're exported from Brazil abroad, and very sadly, many of them were actually kept in the National Museum. So I now imagine have been reduced to ashes. So these scientists also are measuring this Brotocudocrania and saying, look, these people are biologically destined to become extinct. Another British traveler said, to see the Botocudo is to witness the deathbed of a dying race, or something like that. So all these discourses about it, they're just on their way out. So my point is that indigenous extinction is an idea that the state, in tandem with things like visual artists, literary authors, scientists, this is an idea that's deliberately produced in order to disappear indigenous people, living indigenous people from the nation. While the discourse was one of racial inclusion, in practice, the point that it was driving home was that indigenous people did not belong in the present. But interestingly, as a sign of how malleable this idea also was, this idea of indigenous extinction then gets transposed onto Black Brazilians. Lacerda, the head of the National Museum, actually says Black people will soon disappear too. And then later on the other hand, José do Patrocínio, a famous abolitionist, argues, look, the Portuguese mixed and did not massacre indigenous people like the Spaniards. This paean of racial assimilation can be a model for Afro-Brazilian inclusion into the nation. So it gets used in different ways. But nonetheless, I wanted to bring this up because only by looking at this discourse of race mixture, not just as a discourse, but also in the way it was put into policy and practice through indigenous people, we see how it was very deliberately produced as a way of excluding indigenous people. And I think, to me, it was kind of starting to think about how much we as historians and scholars have taken this so much for granted, right? We go into archives, we study Brazil, most of us who do the 19th century, we study Black people, we study slavery. Of course, there were 5 million Africans brought to Brazil, and there is also the issue of numbers. But how often do we think about why there are no indigenous people? So it really kind of made me think about our own complicity in repeating these narratives and how harmful that can be. Another chapter that I write is actually about the law and violence. I'm going to kind of just talk about it, just very briefly, just summarize it. So this is a case in which this is a chapter in which I compare two acts of extravagant violence in this region on the Atlantic frontier. One is the massacre of an entire indigenous village by settlers and their Indian allies in 1881. And the other case that I look at is a very gruesome case of a very prominent slave-owning family that castrates and executes one of its male slaves. Why? Because he had impregnated their daughter, who was his white mistress. So it's an interracial sex that leads to the castration, execution of this slave. And just briefly, I analyze these forms of violence. And one of the things I want to do is to compare the legal regimes for Black and indigenous people, for enslaved Black and indigenous people. And often scholars who study slavery, slave punishment and law are kind of looking at, especially for the case of 19th century Brazil, oh, look, there's less capital punishment, there's more inclusion, there's more protection for indigenous people, there's more protection for slaves, abolishing the lash, restricting this, abolishing capital punishment. So scholars have often looked at this as ways of arguing for greater legal inclusion of enslaved people and their kind of greater access towards citizenship. But I wanted to juxtapose it with these indigenous people and their massacre, in which the case is basically completely dismissed. In the end, first, there was a great, compelling case, lots of evidence, testimonies, and then it all falls apart. And by the end, the case falls apart because the justice says there were no bodies. So the case has just disappeared entirely. So I kind of wanted to think about that to mention how we can't just be thinking about laws in relation to slavery to make greater claims about popular citizenship, that it's kind of dangerous to do that. Just quickly speaking about final two chapters. So one of the chapters that I first launched that I've talked about the most too is about quilombos. Quilombolas, of course, very famous in Brazil, in Brazilian history. So I'll just mention it only briefly because some of you have read it too, perhaps. But here I'm looking at a group of quilombolas, Maroons in 1880s, or the year 1880, 1881. I found, well, thanks to the generosity of Flávio Gomes, a Brazilian historian, an entire court case, testimonies full of these quilombolas speaking about their experiences. And what I'm arguing in this chapter is that we can think about, this is an era already in Brazil where the abolition of slavery is becoming, it's an impending reality, right? It's 1888, so it's very soon. But this is a region that's still very pro-slavery. Why? There's so few laborers that people are just basically not interested. They don't have alternatives to slave labor, or if not forced indigenous labor. But what's interesting about these quilombolas, who are both male and female, is that they don't run away. You know, right, we usually think of Maroons as fleeing very far away, isolated regions, out of access, but it's the opposite. They actually flee basically next door. They're actually residing on a property that's like literally next door to where their master was living, which seems kind of ridiculous and incredible, but that's what happens. And they're there for years, which is the other incredible thing. So what I'm saying in this quilombola case is that what they end up doing is collapsing the distance between the space of flight and the space of slavery and kind of changing the meaning of the geography. So I call this practice insurgent geographies. And I wanted to think about how these quilombolas' spatial claims can be read as a practice of citizenship. So what does it mean to flee slavery yet stay exactly where you are, or just literally a stone's throw away from your master? Could we read that as a way of giving new meaning to the territory that enslaves you? You flee because you know you don't flee far because this is where you belong. You have your family, you have your friends, you are a mother, you want to work as a free laborer. These are the things that they're claiming. And so I read these as ways in which they were making their own definitions of citizenship. For me, one of the most important parts of this chapter has been to see how women Maroons actually fled to be with their children, sometimes for years, and sometimes they were just alone, maybe with a toddler. At least 2 of these Maroon women even give birth while they're in flight. And so this went against this very common belief that women rarely fled because they had children. I also look at the tensions among the quilombolas, rather than presuming they were united by some common, clear anti-slavery goal. In fact, there was actually a lot of infighting, and they kept on getting split up, reformulated. And there's a lot of gendered tension. For example, the male Maroons are often fighting each other over leadership. And I also saw that male Maroons often prevented women from carrying weapons or accessing certain food sources. So this kind of interesting way to see the gendered relations. And nonetheless, many of them stay together. And finally, this chapter comes closest to a biography, if such a thing were possible. I trace the colorful life of a legendary Maroon leader named Benegito, who flees from prison, attacks expedition leaders, and just keeps on escaping. They never are able to catch him. He's a celebrity. He's actually known as celebre criminoso, and he does ridiculous things. It sounds almost like a movie. He literally escapes from prison. He was in shackles. Someone brings in sheep fat. He puts the sheep fat on, slips out of his shackles, makes a rope out of a sheet, and he jumps over the wall. It sounds kind of ridiculous, but it's one of the things he does. So in 1880, he appears as just this criminal. But 4 years later, he reappears in the sources. He's still a Maroon, but he's in a completely different light. He's now suspected of leading an anti-slavery insurrection. By this time, Brazil slavery is being abolished in 4 provinces. So what's particularly fascinating about these Maroons and about this guy Benegito is that they're never alone. They're always part of this vast social network of people who know them, who protect them, who help them, and maybe who also fear them. In Benegito's case, the police are unable to capture him because a whole group of people who are always protecting him. There's his girlfriend, Ana, his mother, who lives in the European slave plantation I talked about. They're free people. And eventually there's even an abolitionist. All these people claim, I just saw him. I saw him over there. He was crossing a swamp. I don't even know that they actually saw him. But it becomes this really interesting way of thinking about how the act of witnessing this Maroon becomes a way, I think, for people to participate in these growing debates over anti-slavery. That's even happening in this frontier region. For some people, he was a criminal. He's accused of being a rapist. For others, he was a boyfriend, he was a rabble-rouser, and he was a leader of an anti-slavery insurrection. And what's fascinating to me is that in my sources, I actually found a police report saying that he was finally gunned down by the police on that European colony at age around 27. But in the oral histories that have been made of him in the 60s, he lived until he was 80. So I thought that was kind of a fascinating way of thinking about how he continues to live on in memory. And actually, so in this town of San Mateos in northern Espírito Santo, even today, if you go there and something weird happens, people say, "Fue Benedito." Like he's still kind of about part of the public consciousness. And just to conclude, quickly, I just want to talk about labor and abolition. So in this last chapter, I examine how the impending abolition of slavery creates a labor crisis in this region, and that actually ends up renewing interest in indigenous labor. So we always think about abolition, right? Atlantic abolition, Brazilian abolition, we think about in the context of Haiti, about second slavery, about British abolitionism. So we're used to kind of thinking about it in this Atlantic context in relation to other slave societies. But I want to propose that we reframe this framework, not to deny that other framework, but to think about it in a different way. Kind of going back to the beginning when I was talking about indigenous slavery, I was wondering what it means to frame the struggle for Black freedom and emancipation in Brazil as taking place in this ambiguous aftermath of indigenous emancipation. So we think about slavery and abolition always in the Atlantic world context, but what does it mean to consider Brazilian slave emancipation in relation to the continuation of illegal Indian enslavement and coerced labor long after Indian slavery is already abolished in 1831. So we're talking about, right, over 50 years later. So to think about this, I compare the process of frontier abolition or abolitionism and Indian missions activities, two areas in which these ideas of Black freedom and indigenous citizenship are being formed through the lens of labor. As I mentioned earlier, there's a very virulent and strong pro-slavery bloc in this region. There's a chronic labor shortage. There are no alternatives, so people who have their slaves have little interest in letting go of them. So there is a local abolitionist who emerges, a very colorful guy who writes kind of two-page documents with no periods. Really interesting guy. Yeah, don't write that way, by the way. And so he's accused of fomenting a slave insurrection, right? Inciting slaves, right? The classic kind of accusation. And so these planters imprison this abolitionist. But at the same time, local landowners in the region are also increasingly in conflict with the missionaries because they think the missionaries are preventing them from using indigenous laborers, and they're also very envious of the vast territory, the land that the mission occupies. They want that land. But if we think about it as good abolitionists and missionaries versus pro-slavery and like big latifundia landowners, it's not so clear. Because when you actually look at what these abolitionists and missionaries are proposing, they're servile labor regimes. Let's control these people. Let's make sure they stay on this land. We give them the land they can work on. They need to be taught, because otherwise they will be lazy. They will not be civilized. So it's actually the discourses that abolitionist missionaries and even pro-slavery people are using are actually very similar. So I kind of read this to see how they're actually kind of creating these regimes of labor as abolition is approaching to create a new form of servile labor and a kind of basically a second-class citizenry. So I end this chapter by actually kind of looking at the other perspective. There was a huge uprising of 2,000 freed people on that European slave plantation. They're mostly angry that they don't have land. A lot of the good land has been eroded through bad practices. Most of the European immigrants have already left because it's not productive anymore. So these free people who are left have an uprising. And just a few years later, in this large mission more towards the interior, which basically had several hundred Indians or maybe several thousand Indians at this point, and they're led by these Italian missionaries. They're all actually Italian. There's a huge revolt of 700 to 800 Indians, 700 to 800 Indians. They were considered to be civilized, but one night they launch an attack on the missionaries, and they destroy the entire mission to the ground. And those of, I guess this is where I had to bring some ethnography. Some people believe, reading this, that the indigenous people blamed the starvation, the smallpox, the deaths on witchcraft that they thought the missionaries had introduced. But whatever the case, it was kind of a very kind of startling response to these servile labor projects that were being envisioned for them by missionaries, for abolitionists and the like. So to conclude, I've tried through this book to show how bringing together the histories of Black and Indigenous people in post-colonial Brazil allows us to recognize the formations of inequalities embedded in the very construction of Brazil's inclusive citizenship. How do their histories intersect and shape each other? It was a very difficult endeavor, and I have to confess, I took a lot longer to write this book than I had wished. But I'm glad I did it, and I also think it was necessary. It's been my attempt to kind of think about these these epistemological foundations of Latin American history. Why do we tell the histories about and why do we tell these stories about Latin America in the ways that we do? What is our own role in reproducing certain narratives? And most importantly, I hope that this book will help engender discussions about new ways of thinking about our present and even the future and how we talk about them. And I really hope even now what's happening in Brazil, and I didn't get to talk about the kind of the epilogue in the 20th century and the current, and how this kind of reflects upon the present. But I hope that it can still foster discussion about the present and what we can do moving forward. Thank you. Sorry, totally
That
done
was
what
a
time was.
very successful book pitch. I'm going to be adopting your book on my next History of Brazil class. Sounds like a fabulous new opportunity.
It's narrative, not to.
We have time. I know some of you have to leave for class, but if you would like to join us here still a little bit, you want to get something to, can get something? Yeah. We have opportunity for questions, and I'm going to let you can field the questions and answers, and we'll go for another 10, 15 minutes, and just ask people. And
Yes, Neil and.
I'm going to have to take off right
Yeah.
away. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'll answer in 3 words. Okay, thank you.
I think what was really interesting about it is so much about your own process of discovery and the way in which you're bringing together these different historiographies that in different, I would say, different national and even imperial contexts are left out to different measures. And I think that's one of the interesting things about thinking about the Americas sort of as a whole, is thinking about, and also thinking about the different periods in different ways. Certain aspects, like, as you referred to, like in the colonial period, somehow these different actors maybe have slightly more equal weight. And then at different points in Brazil's history, as you've laid out, certain individuals drop out. There are different kinds of groups, certain geographical groups as well. So I'm not sure what my question is, other than to say that I would really encourage you to do, and maybe you have this in your book, a kind of a methodological essay. Microphone didn't like that idea. Of why your story is relevant and pertinent to other historiographies.
No. Okay.
Something in the control room. And also just, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear your reflections about at different times within Brazil's history, how these elements kind of come in and out of focus. If that makes sense.
And I know you have to go, so I'll just answer
Yeah.
it quickly. Well, this is not a methodological essay, but I'm kind of constantly trying to make the argument that this is not just for Brazilianness, it's kind of, I want whoever's writing about Latin America and also my training in African diaspora. Yeah, it's like step outside, like it's kind of almost has a danger of becoming an echo chamber, right? Where you're just reading things that reaffirm the ideas that already formed you coming into the field. And especially as I was revising it for the final edition, I was kind of constantly encouraged by the lovely Amy Chesko to connect it to liberal nation-building projects in the rest of Latin America, for instance. The consolidation of latifundia, like these big landowning, creation of inequality, the disenfranchisement of the poor. Like she's like, this isn't at all specific. This is, you can see it across Latin America, so she's kind of encouraging me to make those connections. But also, it's kind of has to start really early. I feel like it's, even like, at the Atlantic world, I trained at NYU for my grad work. By the way, tons of Brown students end up at NYU. I think there's a pipeline. I was at the Schomburg, everybody had gone to Brown, so I think that's a good sign. But it's like the Atlantic world, it's still very like early modern, right? And it's kind of this early modern. I'm like, why do we always keep on confining ourselves to certain periods to? And why is it that you specialize in slavery so you can't look at other things? Why do we confine ourselves this way? And in a way, it's difficult to not do that, but I feel like there's so much to be gained. So I'm hoping that this will kind of encourage people to step outside of from the comfort zone. Yeah, and it takes a lot longer, but yeah, in the back and down. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for the history. It's fascinating. And then in Dominican, and it's similar history that is in the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, if you combine. And I'm doing a study for years. I have not decided to write the book yet, but listening to you and where we are right now and trying to find peace and consensus among us who have no identity because we lost them, because we've been assigned identity. How do you think your book and the information that you've found in regards to the land and the history of slavery and indigenous and the Brazil, because it is very relevant to other countries in the Caribbean, how would that frame the political atmosphere in Brazil, Latin America, and the U.S. from your perspective? I'm not sure if you have that info, but I think it's a way of cultivating where we are projecting and where we should be heading.
So you mean how to frame it in the present?
Your findings.
Uh-huh.
How do you think that will frame the political atmosphere? How we look at candidates or elected official
Right.
in regards to our rights?
Right. I would imagine maybe Jim is a better place to speak about the current political moment, especially for Brazil. But it's interesting because, well, first of all, as a historian, I struggle, right, with these labels, right, with these identities. Categories like Indian are not meaningful to indigenous people. The title Botocudo is an invention by the Portuguese, right? It just kind of puts together people who are wearing religious who are hostile to the Portuguese. So they're not necessarily identities that are meaningful to them, but it's like, but if you don't use them, they kind of disappear again from the historical record. So I was always having this struggle, right? It's like, how do you use these names that are given to them and yet, because otherwise it kind of becomes chaos. So it's like I had to use it in some category. But what's been interesting to me is that, so looking at more of the present moment, to be indigenous and to be especially Quilombo descendant it's a legal category, right? Now, as opposed to the Quilombos that I study historically, which are fugitive slave communities or fugitive slaves, today it's a legal juridical category that's about, right, a rural Black community with strong ties to the past. You don't have to be a descendant of fugitive slaves. But it's become a legal category that allows you to claim land rights, and in doing so, it kind of allows you to, it's like a form of Brazilian reparations, right? It's a very different form of reparations than the one that we see here, for instance, or the British Caribbean. But it becomes a way through land rights and recognition to get more expansive rights about healthcare or better schools, electricity, et cetera, et cetera. And to be indigenous, on the other hand, actually has deep ties to the military dictatorship today. And like, they didn't mean to necessarily, but in 1973, their statute, an indigenous statute, basically allows indigenous people to kind of, if you identify as such, it becomes a form of land demarcation. And their intention was to identify indigenous people so that you could basically relocate them and say, those are your lands, the rest is ours. But what ended up happening was a lot of people started claiming this legal indigenous identity in order to get land recognition. But in doing so, I think they had to relinquish certain rights of citizenship. And they were still technically wards of the state. So that status hasn't really changed since this period that I'm studying. And the 1988 Constitution does now give more rights to indigenous people. They can represent themselves in court, et cetera, but the 1973 statute, sorry, this is kind of technical, was never abolished. So it's not entirely clear, but it seems like they're still protected people. So it's kind of interesting that these identities are still within the purview of the state. It's not like an oppositional identity, but still within the purview of the state. But frankly, with this current person who may very well win the presidency, and then you can speak more to this, he's so explicitly anti-indigenous, anti-Black that I'm nervous at what's going to happen, as you were saying, in universities, but also just protections, or like I could very well see all these demands for land rights and other recognition just falling apart. Yeah. So sorry, it's back.
Just two quick questions.
Yes.
These missionaries that you were talking about,
Yes.
were they primarily Jesuit? And what role does the Roman Catholic Church play in your work?
So the Jesuits were thrown out in the 1760s. Right, one of the reasons was, I guess, technically that the Jesuits were kind of amassed too much power were considered a threat to the crown. So the Capuchin, these are Italian Capuchins that come in the 1840s, and they are very clearly subordinate to the Brazilian state. The Brazilian state appoints directors of Indians, these lay positions, who then appoint these Capuchins. So they're very much integrated into and subservient to the Brazilian state structure. And I'm sorry, your second question? So the Roman Catholic, it's basically an agreement with the Roman Catholic Church, the Holy See in Rome, to introduce these Italian missionaries. So if you look at their names, they have correspondences. A lot of them are actually kept in Rio, in the Capuchin church archives. They're all Italian. Like Fray Angelo di Sassoferrato, something di Genova, like they all have names like that. So they're Italians, but a lot of them turned very violent. And I didn't get into it today, but one missionary in particular who's in this region, the Mucuri River, he's first, like at first he's like, I'm so excited, it's gonna be great. These are all the Indians are all coming to settle, and within a year, this will be a wonderful mission. And a year later, he's like, I hate these people, let's kill them. He's basically joins hands with the settlers. So you see that, yeah, change. Sorry.
Yes, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
It's all fascinating. When you talked about the Constitution and used the language around inclusivity, and then later posited around the slaves are left out, indigenous people, is there any danger in using words like inclusion and yet people are clearly not included? And then the second question is a bit different, but in terms of the homogeneity and miscegenation that then leads to this notion of one body in the nation, did you come across anything in the literature that talked about the colonizing country having a particular impact on how that played out? So in other words, to your point of Dominican Republic, if you look at Cape Verde, Brazil, Portugal and Spain, something I read at some point that talked about their relationship with the Moors, that then impacted the ways in which they tried to do this one body nation building piece. Whereas France and some Northwestern European countries didn't necessarily do it in the same way.
Right.
So did you come across anything?
So your first point about the dangers of talking about inclusion, I think that's the whole point, is that there's a presumed inclusivity, but so much is not said. Like, women are not included. You know, no one includes women, but it's not even mentioned because it doesn't even occur to people that women should be included, right, in the political process. But I think from my experience writing this was that I was like, oh my God, people just, like, I've read other works and people are like, yeah, Indians are included because they're born on the soil. Like, but I was like, but they're not. And the only way that I was able to actually kind of find that out was by actually looking at the debates preceding the actual writing of the Constitution, where people are clearly saying they do not belong in our society. But because it's not mentioned in the actual Constitution, which says you have citizenship if you're born here, I think there is a danger in that. And I think that in my personal interpretation is that they deliberately left it vague. And what that does is actually, it actually erodes especially protection for indigenous people, because there are no laws saying either they are excluded or they are not. So in the paralleling, it's kind of interesting to see if you see parallels in the way that there are more laws explicitly like restricting slave punishment or laws abolishing slavery gradually. You have no equivalent for indigenous people. There's no indigenous protection. All the laws by that time are for seizing their lands. It's land reform laws. It has nothing about indigenous people. And your question on homogeneity, I was just teaching Gilberto Freire and how messed up it is to my undergrads. But just reading the whole like Mozarabic character stuff, I was like, oh wow, he's really strange. I don't know, maybe I'm not the person to speak on this, but I was almost like, what else could they have done? I mean, they wanted European immigration, but they already failed in the region I was studying. They wanted to whiten, and that didn't work out. It became a slave plantation. So I'm presuming that it was that kind of real circumstances in which the race mixture maybe seemed like a more feasible conclusion. Whether it's because of, I don't know if it's because of a Portuguese president. Somebody else may want to speak on that, but I'm kind of very uncomfortable saying because they were inclined towards race mixture. Yeah, but I don't know. I could talk about it later. Yes, and somebody else. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit more about this phenomenon? And I don't know your article. I'm going to have to read it. I apologize.
The extended version is in the book, so
Right,
there's a slave insurrection in that
So
one.
we'll just teach the book rather than the article. Could you talk a little bit more about this weird phenomenon of people running away to next door What are the mechanisms by which the slave owners don't reclaim these people, and what are the forms of resistance to prevent themselves from being reclaimed?
Then that's the interesting, I get that question a lot, right? Literally, people are complaining, like, one guy gets his cattle stolen, and he's like, oh, I knew who it was Lucindo, Julio, and Benedito. And, like, everyone knows everyone, right? And, like, he knows that it was one of them was named Lucindo, because he was his owner. And they're living next door, but in a way, there's kind of an interesting status quo. I think there's a sense of acceptance. That's kind of like, oh, what can we do? But there's also fear. And I think that also comes specifically from living in the same place. Like, these people all know each other. And Maroons were always carrying weapons. So they're not just working on, and this is really astonishing. Like, you see examples of, like, one of the son of this owner where there's a quilombo was set up. He literally sees them just walking across broad daylight. And he's like, oh, I saw the Maroon. They're not even hiding.
But they don't employ any legal mechanism of the state, or Capitão de Mata to
Well, there's no Capitão de Mato. They do have several expeditions. And actually, one of the reasons why there's so much documentation on this Juan de Benedito is because there are repeated police expeditions. So it's kind of like there's a moment of kind of calm, and then it breaks apart again, and there are these expeditions. But they never go that far.
So the notion that, I'm just really trying to get my head around this, is that we really can't reclaim them because they'll kill us if we try to do that, or they won't work for as hard because they're intractable, or because slavery's going to be abolished anyway, because it doesn't make sense that they would let people, just be freed next to them without trying to reclaim their right, or are the slaves making a legal claim that allows?
No, so they're not making a legal claim. They end up in court because they're being tried for fleeing and for being accused of murder. So they actually end up in court for a different reason. They do go after them. It's just that they're not going after them all the time. But does any master go after them all the time? I don't know that they do. And so I think there was fear, but you don't see a clear claim. Like, nobody's making explicit rights, like property rights. It's more like it's kind of this. I think it's one of the times in which it instigates a police expedition is because actually the Maroons actually start infighting, and they start kind of doing too many attacks. Maybe he's gone overboard, and that's kind of tips the balance, and then it invites an expedition. So I feel like to a certain degree, there's kind of a weird balance going on. But I keep on seeing, especially in the testimonies of people who are living there, they're like a little scared of them, especially because they're so close and they're armed. So I think they also have to think about the cost of going after them, which is sometimes more expensive than losing them. So I think there was partly that. Yes, you had was this? Okay.
I had a question about the 20th century. I think you wrote about this in the epilogue, but didn't get a chance to talk about it. And I'm wondering if the descendants of these aldeias recognize some of their indigenous heritage, or whether this sort of inclusion and assimilation as sort of was successful, and there is sort of this sense that this indigenous identity is sort of gone from this region.
So this particular group that I was saying, Botocudo, they're now known as Krenak, and there's literally only like 20 people. It's right. So they're literally almost vanishing. But there are activists. Actually, another scholar who's at University of Washington named Jonathan Warren. He actually works with the surviving groups in this region. And I think that one particular group is just tiny. So they're there, but there's actually a lot of activism, and so they're actually I'm supposed to send my book down to them because they actually were interested in reading it. But so they are claiming it, but in a very active way. But their numbers are tiny, tiny, tiny. And whatever protections or rights they had, I think it's going to be very dangerous with what's going to happen in Brazil. But they're there. Yes.
Chair, I think piggyback to your question, and it may be relevant to what you were saying, is that why they were not going after the slave was because the slave created an alliance. This is in the Dominican Republic. So if 2 or 3 slaves escaped, then that was an alliance that they couldn't go against. They could go after one, but not after 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, because now there was no secret and they have no control of the slavery process.
So because there were more slaves who left, you mean like the number of slaves who fled together?
Yes.
That might be the case, but also.
I mean, I'm talking about in history in the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico and Cuba. That once one escaped, then a few follow, in the few followed, then it was an alliance. Then it became a colony of slavery rather than one slave against the master. So it was a whole group of them. So it was hard now to go after them because it was an alliance.
Well, one of the reasons why it's hard to capture them is because they're protected. And it's not just slaves, it's actually a lot of people who protect them are freed people who perhaps have less means. They need workers, so they use other people's slaves. They're called acoitadores de escravos, slave hiders, and it was actually a huge problem in Brazil. I mean, probably not just Brazil, but these people are living on this guy's property because he's using them as his own laborers. Yeah, so there's kind of conflicting interests there. So of course, this guy is the slave owners are not friends of this guy, but he has a personal economic interest in keeping these slaves. You know, he maybe gives them he never has direct contact. He always makes one of his own slaves go and give them stuff because he doesn't want direct contact. So there was that too. But in terms of, slaves are always fleeing. It invites other people to flee, and that's one of the reasons that they're not like, let's contest slavery. Like, it's never that clear. Often they were like, I wanted to be with my daughter. My friend was there, so I wanted to join my friend. So those are reasons, but they also change over time, I think. And I think being in groups perhaps gave them some organization, but it was also, they were fighting a lot. Men were fighting over women, and men were fighting each other. So the presumption that because they came together, they were a cohesive community, it's really not that clear at all. So what's more interesting to me was that they still stayed together in spite of these internal tensions. Because a lot of it was about knowledge sharing, they were extremely knowledgeable about where to go, the geography, this swamp here, this here, there's food there, we can steal food there. And I think that kind of sharing that knowledge was also very important. But also one of the women in particular, she was fleeing alone for like a few years with a small child, which I think is incredibly difficult, but she did it. And only when it became too difficult, she joined the others. So I think people had different reasons. Yes. Yes, okay.
Yeah, my understanding of quilombos is that they're escaped black slaves.
Mostly. Yeah.
Is there an equivalent for the escaped indigenous people? Do they form communities like quilombos? Do they join quilombos? Is there mixing of black slaves and indigenous slaves, or do they just kind of go on their own?
No, I think there actually was. It's hard to document in the archives, because I say in my book too, but we're kind of always struggling against what the archives are telling, and that's kind of what I'm working on more in my next project. But there's such an interest in keeping them separate that it's very hard to find sources together. So you just find fleeting examples like cabras, right? Like kind of these words about race mixture of black indigenous. You see laws preventing blacks and indigenous people from socializing. But also, even in the oral histories in particular, you hear about, this fugitive slave went into the indigenous regions and he killed a jaguar and he became the indigenous people's king and told them to attack their master. So there's stories like that, and I think that's more of the record where you have to rely on. But one example I did have is actually a group of fugitive slaves and indigenous people who are forced to work for local laborers. They actually flee together. But what happens is that they're tricked by another indigenous group and they're actually sent back. So it's not clear what exactly happened, but at least I saw that as an example. They actually are even working together. They're often the same farmer, for example, would have African or black slaves and indigenous people working in the same place for them. So I think in some cases there's possibly solidarity. And someone who I know, an anthropologist who's doing field work, is finding more evidence about black indigenous communities. And also, there is race mixture, right? There are black indigenous communities who are still there. And I think that, if anything, is evidence. So she's doing more work with oral histories. So I think that would be really interesting to see what she finds. Yes.
Speaking particularly about indigenous European, possibly indigenous European black racial mixing, as you're describing, the supposed disappearance of indigenous populations in the 19th century due to changing definitions of who was indigenous and who was not along cultural terms. That got me thinking about the category of the caboclo, which we see emerging, especially in the early 20th century literature, as being either the most authentic Brazilian identity, or conversely a huge problem for the expanding nation state in Brazil. Do you see in any of the literature that you look at in the 19th century already this notion of the caboclo, either from in official documents or any notion of people self-identifying in any sense as being kind of in between, not quite,
Right. Actually,
not
and
quite indigenous.
right, and I thank you for asking that, because actually, caboclo specifically appears for the first time in the census in 1872. So it's exactly the period of extinction discourse that I'm studying. And this is significant because if you are a wild Indian, as in you're an autonomous indigenous person, you're not counted in the census, right? You actually, in the official record, you don't exist in the nation, right? The only way to appear in the census is as a caboclo, which already implies somebody who's assimilated or someone who's racially mixed. So in that sense, that's the only way that indigenous people or anybody of indigenous ancestry gets included in the nation. But in other places, for instance, I just briefly mentioned earlier, there is a massacre of this entire indigenous village, and they're autonomous Indians. And they actually, the testimonies say, like, I killed caboclo like the devil. They use the word caboclo to refer to the indigenous people. That I wasn't quite sure why. I asked some scholars, I think I might have even asked Stuart Schwartz or someone, but they had read it as actually referring to indigenous people. But I'm still not quite sure why they insist on calling them caboclo, because they're clearly autonomous indigenous people, and that's why they were targeted. But yeah, the census, actually, Ivana Stolzalima writes about the censuses, but it's really interesting to see how it appears. And at this period, it's still used in a disparaging way. Like Varnhagen, that conservative senator, he was like, caboclo patriotism. Like, he's very dismissive of the idea of the caboclo. But yeah, but definitely, I did see them. Right, thank you.